My husband cried harder at our son's adoption than he did at our own wedding. I remember thinking at the time that it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, a grown man undone by love for a baby that wasn't biologically his, sobbing so hard. The judge had to pause the proceedings for a moment to let him collect himself. 3 years later, sitting in my car outside a state records office with a single-page lab report in my hands, I understood exactly why he'd cried that hard. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy. It was the sound of a man watching his own secret get legally sealed shut in front of the one person he'd never told. If you've ever trusted someone with your whole life only to find out they'd been building a second one quietly beside it, stay with me because this story still doesn't feel finished even now. I was 31 when David and I adopted our son, Eli, after 4 years of infertility treatments that never worked. 3 rounds of IVF, 2 miscarriages, and a doctor who eventually told us gently that we should start considering other paths forward. David held my hand through every single one of those appointments, and I never once doubted back then that we were building something together brick by brick with nothing hidden between us. I loved that little boy before I ever held him. I worked as a records compliance reviewer for the state's Adoption Oversight Division. Not a glamorous title, but it meant I spent my days reading other families' adoption files line by line, checking that consent forms were signed correctly, that birth parent information matched, that nothing in a sealed record had been altered after the fact. I was good at it because I noticed the kind of small inconsistencies most people skim past. A date that's a day off. A signature that looks rushed compared to every other signature in the file. A notarization stamp from an office that closed 2 years before the document claims. It's tedious work, and it made me exactly the wrong person to lie to, though nobody in my own house seemed to realize that at the time. I used to joke with coworkers that my job was basically professional suspicion dressed up as paperwork. I never once imagined I'd need that particular skill set inside my own marriage. When David first mentioned a private adoption opportunity, a young birth mother named Ashley who wanted a closed, discreet placement, I was thrilled and a little surprised he hadn't gone through my agency's usual channels, since I obviously had contacts there. "I don't want to mix your work with our family," he told me, holding my hands across the kitchen table. "This one's ours. Let me handle the paperwork for once. You handle everything else in this house." It sounded at the time like generosity. He hired a private adoption attorney, a college friend of his named Marcus Feld, and the whole process moved faster than any adoption I'd ever seen. Crossed my own desk 6 weeks from first contact to placement, when the ones I processed for a living usually took the better part of a year. I remember asking him once over dinner how he'd even found Ashley in the first place. A guy from my gym mentioned her situation. He said, not quite meeting my eyes, reaching for his water glass. Small world, I guess. I didn't push further because I trusted him completely, and because after 4 years of failed treatments, the idea of a baby finally arriving felt too fragile to interrogate. I remember thinking later how strange it was that a detail that small had made him reach for his water glass at all. David rarely fidgeted with anything when he talked, not even when he was nervous about something real. I noticed the speed. I filed it away the way I filed away small oddities at work without immediately knowing what to do with it. Eli came home 3 weeks later, 7 pounds and perfect, and David cried at the courthouse the day the adoption was finalized, cried in a way I'd never seen him cry. Not soft tears, but the shaking kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than joy usually lives. I held his hand and thought I understood exactly what that grief-shaped relief looked like. I didn't understand anything yet. The first crack came about 18 months in, small enough that I almost laughed it off. David's sister Karen was holding Eli at a 4th of July barbecue, tilting his chin up toward the sun, and said half to herself, "God, he's got David's exact smile. It's honestly uncanny for a kid who isn't even his." Nobody else at the table reacted. David laughed it off, genetics are weird, I guess, and poured himself another drink a little too quickly. I brought it up to David that night, gently, not accusing him of anything, just curious. "Karen said something funny about Eli looking like you." He went very still for a second before he said, She says that about every kid, you know how she is, and changed the subject to something about his work schedule. I let it go the way I'd let a lot of small things go by then, because I loved my life, and I didn't want to go looking for cracks in it. The second crack came about 6 months after that. I found a recurring charge on our joint account, $650 a month memo line, just reading personal, going to an account I didn't recognize. When I asked, David said it was a student loan from before we married that he'd never told me about because he was embarrassed about the debt. It's almost paid off, he said. I didn't want you to think less of me over old money problems. I believed him because I had no reason not to, and because $650 a month sounded exactly like a plausible student loan payment. At Eli's second birthday party, Karen cornered me by the drink table, glass of wine in hand, and said quieter this time, like she half regretted saying it at all. You know, for a closed adoption, David sure asked me a lot of questions about Ashley before you two ever met her lawyer. I asked what kind of questions. Karen's face did something complicated, guilt maybe, or the beginning of it before she said, just, general stuff. Forget I said anything, I've had too much wine, and walked away before I could ask anything else. I raised it with David again that spring, this time more directly sitting across from him at dinner. I want to use my own agency's home study team if we ever adopt again, I said. I think it's silly we didn't the first time. His whole posture changed, shoulders up, jaw tight. Why does it matter now? It's done. Eli's ours. Why do you keep bringing up the paperwork like something's wrong with it? I never said something was wrong with it, I said. I just asked a question. Well, it feels like an accusation, he said, and left the table before dessert, which he had never once done in 9 years of marriage. A month later, I overheard him on the phone in the garage, voice low, saying something like, I told you I'd handle it. Just give me time, before he noticed me in the doorway, and hung up fast, saying it was a work thing. Nothing important. I asked which client. He said a name I didn't recognize and changed the subject to Eli's daycare schedule so quickly that I let it drop, mostly because I didn't yet have a reason strong enough to push harder, and partly because some part of me was afraid of what pushing harder might find. Around the same time, I asked Karen directly at a quiet moment away from the rest of the family what she'd meant that day at the birthday party about David asking her questions. She wouldn't meet my eyes. It's really not my place, she said. Ask David if it matters that much to you. I told her it did matter, and she just repeated quieter. It's not my place, and changed the subject to whether I'd tried the new pediatrician yet. 2 weeks after that, at a family dinner, I almost skipped out of exhaustion. David's father made an offhand comment about how lucky we'd been to find such a smooth adoption, not like the horror stories you hear about. David laughed a beat too loud and said something about being blessed, and Karen across the table looked down at her plate instead of laughing, along which was the first time I noticed she wasn't just uncomfortable. She looked almost guilty in a way that had nothing to do with me. I filed that away too, the same drawer as everything else. Not long after Eli came down with a fever bad enough that our pediatrician asked almost in passing whether there was any family medical history on the birth father's side I could provide, since the adoption file listed him as unknown. I told her I'd check with the attorney. When I mentioned it to David that night, he went quiet for a beat too long before saying he'd look into it and never brought it up again, not once, not even after Eli's fever broke and the question should have stopped mattering. A few weeks after the fever incident, David's mother mentioned at a Sunday dinner that she'd run into David's old friend from the gym, the one who mentioned the adoption situation originally at the grocery store, and that the man had seemed confused when she brought it up, like he didn't remember the conversation at all. David laughed it off, quickly said his mother must have the wrong guy, and steered the conversation toward Eli's upcoming preschool enrollment. I watched Karen's face during that exchange, and for just a second before she caught herself, she looked like someone watching a lie land badly and deciding again to say nothing. I sat there a long time after David left the table that spring evening, running back through everything, Karen's comments, the $650 charge, the 6-week timeline, the phone call in the garage, the way David's tears at the courthouse had felt less like joy and more like grief with nowhere else to go. None of it on its own was proof of anything, All of it together in the particular way I'd been trained for 6 years to notice patterns other people waved off as coincidence felt like a file I would have flagged at work without a second thought. If you'd noticed those same 3 or 4 small things over 18 months, a comment, a charge, a defensive flinch, a fever visit question that never got answered, would you have said something right then, or waited until you had real proof? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I still ask myself that question more than I'd like to admit. I didn't confront David again after that dinner. I did what I actually knew how to do, which was pull the file. Not our file, I wasn't allowed to touch that one professionally, and I knew exactly how badly it would look if I tried. Instead, I quietly reached out to a colleague at the Vital Records office I'd worked alongside for years, someone who owed me a favor from a case I'd helped her untangle 2 years earlier, and asked her off the record to check whether an amended birth certificate existed for a child born the same month as Eli under the name Ashley had used. It took her 4 days to call me back. There's an amendment, she said. Filed about 5 weeks after the birth. Father's name changed from unknown to blank, then sealed under the adoption order. That's not unusual for adoptions generally. But the timing's odd, given how fast everything else moved on this one. That was the moment I stopped hoping I was imagining things. I sat with that information for almost a week before I did anything else with it, partly because I was scared of where it led, and partly because I wanted to be sure I wasn't building a case out of coincidence the way I'd spent 6 years warning junior reviewers not to do. I kept going back to Eli's baby pictures during that week, looking for anything in his face that might have told me sooner, and hating myself a little for looking. I went back through every file I could legally access on adoptions Marcus Feld had personally handled over the past 5 years, looking for a pattern in his caseload, and found something small, but telling. Nearly every other closed adoption he'd processed had taken between 8 and 11 months from first contact to placement. Ours was the only one on record that had closed in 6 weeks. I found Marcus Feld's private cell number in an old email David had forwarded me 3 years earlier about the closing costs, and I called him directly, telling him only that I had questions about the file as the adoptive mother reviewing our own paperwork, which was true. Marcus was cagey at first, the way lawyers get when they sense a question underneath a question, but he confirmed one detail that mattered more than anything else. Ashley hadn't come to him as a stranger seeking placement. David had brought her to him. I'm not going to discuss anything covered by attorney-client privilege, Marcus said when I pushed further, but I'll say this much off the record because I think you deserve to hear it from someone. You should ask your husband who introduced them, not what a guy at the gym said. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, thinking about how carefully David had built that gym friend story, and how easily I'd accepted it, because I'd had no reason yet to doubt the man I'd built a life with. It's strange looking back how much of a marriage runs on simply not checking the things you have no reason to check. I still needed something undeniable, not just circumstantial. So I did the one thing I'd been avoiding for weeks, because some part of me already knew what it would say. I collected a strand of hair from Eli's hairbrush and one from David's razor, and I sent both to a lab 3 states away using my maiden name on the paperwork, so it wouldn't trace back to anyone David might ask about. The results came back on a Tuesday, 11 days later, 1 page, almost clinical in how little emotion it carried. Probability of paternity, 99.98%. 10 words that undid 3 years of my life sat printed in the same flat font a lab uses to report a cholesterol panel. I sat in my car outside the records office for 40 minutes before I could make myself start the engine. 3 days after that, Karen called me out of nowhere, asking if she could take Eli to the park so you and David can have a night to yourselves. It felt in hindsight less like a kind gesture and more like an errand. A way of clearing the house, of checking gently whether I'd said anything to anyone yet, of reporting back that everything still looked calm from where she was standing. You two seem a little off lately, she added almost carelessly, watching my face while she said it. Everything okay? I told her everything was fine, and she studied me for a second too long before saying, Good. I'm glad. David's been stressed at work, that's all. He mentioned it to me last week. I hadn't heard David mention any stress to me at all, which told me more than anything Karen actually said out loud. I said yes to the park anyway. I needed one quiet night in that house before everything in it changed, and I needed to know for certain exactly what I was about to say, and in what order, because I only wanted to say it once. I waited until Eli was asleep and Karen had dropped him back home. David was in the kitchen rinsing dishes, humming something under his breath, and I set the lab report on the counter next to his hands. "I know Eli is your biological son," I said. "I know Ashley isn't a stranger. I know you brought her to Marcus, not the other way around." David froze completely, hands still in the sink water. "Rachel, I can explain." "You cried at the courthouse," I said. "I thought it was joy. It was guilt, wasn't it?" "It was both," he said, turning around now, his voice cracking in a way I recognized from that exact day 3 years earlier. I panicked. Ashley wasn't going to keep him. She was going to place him with strangers, actual strangers, and I couldn't let my own son grow up not knowing me. I thought if we adopted him together, he'd still be raised by his father, and you'd never have to know it cost you anything. I thought I was protecting everyone. "How long were you seeing her?" I asked before you decided that. He didn't answer right away, which was its own answer. "It was over before you and I got married," he finally said. "Mostly." "Mostly," I repeated. "That's not a real word, David. I made a mistake years ago, and then I made another one trying to fix it quietly instead of just telling you the truth," he said. "I know how that sounds." "Does Karen know?" I asked. "Is that why she's been so strange?" He looked away first, which answered that too. "She found out by accident a few months in. I asked her to keep it quiet for Eli's sake." "For Eli's sake," I repeated. "Not for mine." "It sounds," I said, "like you decided alone that I wasn't someone who got a vote in my own life." For one long moment, I watched something genuinely break open in him. Real fear, real exhaustion. The look of a man who had been carrying a lie so heavy for so long that saying it out loud looked almost like relief. His hands were shaking against the counter, and for just a second, he looked younger than I'd ever seen him, like the version of him that must have existed the day Ashley first told him she was pregnant. I almost reached for them out of old habit. Then his voice steadied and something in his eyes closed back over. "But you can't tell me it didn't work out," he said. "You love him. I love him. We're still a family. Doesn't that matter more than how it happened?" "You don't get to decide that for me, either," I said. "You made that decision alone for 3 years, and you let me build a life on top of it without ever asking whether I'd have wanted a say. So what, you're just going to blow up our whole family over paperwork?" he said. And I heard underneath it the same defensive edge from the dinner months earlier. The same instinct to make my questions sound like the real problem instead of the thing they'd uncovered. "It's not paperwork," I said, quiet now, tired. "It's 3 years of you deciding what I was allowed to know." He didn't have an answer for that. He just stood there, dish towel still in his hand, while the birth certificate's official line, "Father, unknown," sat on the counter next to a lab report that said the opposite in 10 flat words. I didn't need to raise my voice to make him see it. The 2 pieces of paper did it for me. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived forwarded through Marcus's office from Ashley herself. She wrote that she wanted me to know the whole truth, not just David's version of it, that their relationship hadn't ended cleanly before I ever met David, that it had continued on and off for almost 2 years into our marriage, and that the adoption hadn't been David's spontaneous act of love. It had been a plan they built together over 8 months once she got pregnant specifically, so David could keep his son without ever losing his wife. She wrote that the $650 monthly charge I'd found wasn't an old student loan at all. It was money. David had continued sending her for over a year after the adoption closed, part of an agreement that she'd stay quiet, stay away, and never contact Eli directly. She said the payments had only stopped a few months before I found the report, right around the same time David started getting defensive at the dinner table whenever I brought up adopting again through proper channels, as if some part of him had known even then that the ground under his careful arrangement was starting to shift. She said she was telling me now 2 years after signing away her legal rights to her own son, because she was tired of being the only one who'd carried that secret's full weight alone, and because she thought Eli deserved someday to know the truth from someone who wasn't afraid of it. She said one more thing near the end of the letter that I've read a dozen times since, that David had asked her more than once during those 8 months of planning whether she thought I'd ever actually find out. She said she'd told him it didn't matter, because by the time I did, it would already be too late to change anything. She said she hoped for my sake that she'd been wrong about that. I haven't left David, and I haven't decided to stay either, not in any clean final way. Some mornings I catch myself watching him make Eli's breakfast, still humming that same tune under his breath, and I feel almost nothing but love. Other mornings, the same scene makes my chest go tight in a way I don't have a clean word for yet. Eli is still my son in every way that matters to me, and nothing about that truth changes what I feel when he falls asleep against my shoulder, small and trusting, with no idea how much adult wreckage sits quietly around the edges of his life. We've started seeing separate therapists, and one shared one, and some weeks that feels like progress, and other weeks it feels like two people politely waiting to see who breaks first. Karen and I haven't spoken since the letter arrived. I don't know yet whether that's a door closing for good, or just one that needs more time before it opens again, and for now, I've stopped needing an answer to that either. My marriage sits somewhere unresolved right now, and I've stopped pretending that's a problem I need to fix on a deadline. Some situations don't get a tidy ending. Mine might just get an honest one instead, whatever that ends up looking like. What I've learned sitting with all of this is that love built on a hidden foundation doesn't stop being real. It just stops being simple. I'd rather know exactly what I'm standing on than keep mistaking someone else's guilt for grief, even when the knowing costs more than the not knowing ever did. If you've ever found out the truth was buried somewhere you never thought to look, tell me in the comments what finally cracked it open for you. A comment someone let slip a charge on a bank statement, a feeling you couldn't quite name until the proof caught up to it. If this story hit close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth is worth finding even late, even when it costs more than staying comfortable ever would have, and subscribe, because there's another story like this one waiting for you next week.